September 15, 1943. A wounded Japanese sergeant expected torture, starvation, maybe execution. Instead, the first thing he smelled on American soil was fresh bread. Sergeant Yoshio Nakamura gripped the ship's railing as his boots touched Angel Island, California. Through the morning fog, impossible sights assaulted his senses. American soldiers shared lunch with Chinese dock workers. Electric lights blazed across the harbor despite wartime. Children played baseball beyond the wire fence, completely unguarded. A Red Cross woman approached with steaming coffee, speaking careful Japanese phrases from a pocketbook. Koko wa jigoku ja nai, he whispered. This was not the hell he had been trained to expect. The intake facility shattered every assumption. Nakamura shuffled forward behind 23 other prisoners from the hospital ship Solace, his bandaged shoulder throbbing from Guadalcanal shrapnel. He anticipated interrogation, torture, execution. Instead, Captain James Watanabe of the Army Medical Corps approached with impossibly advanced instruments. The stethoscope was warm against his chest. Then came the miracle, real penicillin. The wonder drug they had only heard whispered about in Japanese hospitals, now injected into enemy veins without hesitation. Watanabe spoke perfect Japanese, explaining each procedure while documenting injuries with care surpassing Imperial Army standards. This is impossible, Nakamura thought. They treat us better than our own army. The psychological vertigo deepened during Geneva Convention briefings. Staff Sergeant Roy Matsumoto, whose family was imprisoned at Manzanar, while he served in American uniform, read prisoner rights in flawless Japanese. Every protection was explained carefully. Questions were encouraged. When Private Ito asked about Buddhist dietary restrictions, Matsumoto consulted guidelines and confirmed accommodation. The sight of enemy soldiers with Japanese faces created impossible contradictions. These Nisei Americans possessed all cultural markers of Japanese identity, yet served democracy against divine emperor. Their existence violated assumptions about racial unity and imperial destiny. If the medicine shocked them, the democracy broke them. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, housed 4,000 Japanese prisoners in barracks resembling college dormitories. The leadership structure violated every principle of Imperial Army hierarchy. On his third morning, prisoners gathered for democratic election. Enemy captives choosing their own leaders through secret ballot? Captain Harold Morrison explained through interpreter Staff Sergeant George Nakashima. Prisoners would elect spokesmen, committee members, coordinators. Every decision would involve prisoner participation. Private Yamada, barely 20 and lowest ranking, raised his hand to ask questions. In Imperial Army culture, such behavior merited severe punishment. Here, Morrison answered patiently, encouraging more questions. When Yamada suggested meal scheduling changes, Morrison took notes and promised consideration. A private can challenge an officer and win, Nakamura thought. In Japan, he would be beaten. The election consumed a week of campaigning and debates, inconceivable under divine emperor system. Corporal Tanaka argued for longer library hours. Sergeant Fujiwara advocated agricultural programs. Technical Sergeant Kimura proposed baseball tournaments. Men who had never questioned authority crafted political platforms. Committee meetings created deeper dissonance. Former Imperial Army officers sat equally with enlisted men, discussing policies through parliamentary procedure. When Sergeant Sato disagreed with Lieutenant Ito's calisthenics proposal, he stated opposition publicly without retribution. The lieutenant listened and modified his position based on merit. University of Wisconsin extension programs challenged prisoners with forbidden ideas. Professor William Hayes conducted seminars on American political philosophy, individual rights, democratic representation, separation of powers, concepts that contradicted emperor worship. The camp library contained books banned in Japan since the 1930s, democracy texts, socialist theory, Christian philosophy, things you could be executed for owning back home, now handed freely by the enemy. But the deepest cut came not from doctors or soldiers, but from American civilians. The Great Western Sugar Company's beet fields stretched across Colorado like endless green oceans. Foreman Bill McKenzie explained work rotation at the Greeley plant, 80 cents daily in camp script, same as American privates. Overtime opportunities, rest breaks every 2 hours. The concept violated everything Nakamura knew. In Japan, workers endured 16-hour shifts, driven by emperor duty and punishment, fear. Here, Mexican braceros worked alongside German prisoners, supervised by Americans who treated enemy laborers as temporary employees. When temperatures exceeded 90 degrees, work stopped automatically. At Bemidji Lumber Camp in Minnesota, Technical Sergeant Hayashi operated steam equipment processing more timber in one morning than Japanese mills handled weekly. Workers competed for efficiency bonuses rather than avoiding punishment. Foremen encouraged improvement suggestions rather than demanding silent obedience. Food processing facilities created profound shock. The Del Monte cannery discarded perfectly edible corn for minor cosmetic flaws. Irregular kernels, underripe tomatoes, blemished beans, all destroyed while Japanese civilians faced starvation. Plant supervisor Robert Walsh apologized for 12-hour shifts, while offering overtime pay exceeding Japanese monthly wages. When Private Suzuki injured his hand at Wisconsin Steelworks, he received immediate medical attention, compensation payments, light duty until recovery, treatment exceeding what Japanese soldiers expected from their own military. "We are prisoners," Suzuki whispered, "yet they care for us better than our emperor cared for his soldiers." The supervised shopping excursion to Sparta, Wisconsin, on December 20th, shattered assumptions about American women. Nakamura walked behind guards through Main Street, observing sights that contradicted propaganda about Western decadence. Mrs. Dorothy Henderson managed First National Bank, making financial decisions affecting farming communities, while her husband served with Pacific Fleet. She wore business attire, spoke with authority to male subordinates, conducted transactions without seeking masculine approval. In Imperial Japan, women bowed submissively and spoke only when addressed. Here, female bank presidents commanded respect. At Mueller's hardware store, Negro employees served white customers alongside European immigrants and Yankees. The German-American manager supervised Irish and Polish staff. Productivity flowed from cooperation rather than racial purity. Christmas preparations demonstrated impossible civilian resilience. Families with sons fighting Japanese forces decorated homes with wasteful electric lights. Children played openly without military supervision. Teenagers gathered at soda fountains, sharing milkshakes and listening to jazz music embraced as national expression. The Sparta Herald contained editorials criticizing Pacific Theater military strategy. Citizens questioned Roosevelt's policies, debated resource allocation, demanded general accountability. Such dissent meant execution in Imperial Japan, yet American democracy thrived through organized disagreement. First Presbyterian Church learned Japanese Christmas carols phonetically for enemy prisoners. Reverend William Patterson, whose son was missing in the Philippines, led congregation members singing Silent Night in halting Japanese. The son of an American family killed in the Pacific, singing Japanese hymns to men who wore his killer's uniform. Mrs. Sarah Mackenzie, whose husband died at Pearl Harbor, approached prisoners with homemade cookies and genuine cultural curiosity. "I baked these for you boys, even though my husband died at Pearl Harbor," she said simply. Her questions about Buddhist philosophy carried no hatred, despite personal loss. American civilians treated Japanese prisoners as temporarily displaced persons rather than permanent enemies. Store clerks offered purchase assistance. Children waved from school buses. Elderly farmers discussed agricultural techniques without considering racial differences. The cultural collision was complete. Individual freedom functioning within social order. Democratic strength through apparent chaos. Human dignity transcending wartime hatred. 3 men embodied the transformation, destroying warrior culture from within. Corporal Hiroshi Yamamoto arrived carrying a ceremonial tanto blade, determined to restore honor through ritual suicide rather than endure captivity's shame. His transformation began with accumulated contradictions over 18 months. The turning point came during Professor Hayes's literature seminar, discussing Hamlet's soliloquy about suicide and moral courage. Yamamoto realized choosing life to serve others required greater bravery than choosing death to escape dishonor. His letters home document gradual abandonment of Bushido suicide ideology. By March 1945, he wrote describing American individual dignity concepts transcending military defeat. After repatriation, Yamamoto became a teacher advocating democratic education reforms. His constitutional principle discussions influenced thousands during Reconstruction. Technical Sergeant Kenji Moto's conversion required complete spiritual reconstruction. Raised venerating Hirohito as divine descendant of sun goddess Amaterasu, he had never questioned imperial authority until witnessing civilians criticizing Roosevelt without consequence. Monthly psychological evaluations tracked his evolution from absolute loyalty to nuanced political thinking. The decisive moment came Christmas 1944, when Wisconsin families provided gifts to enemy prisoners whose countrymen had killed American sons. Moto wrote in his diary, "These people whose children we murdered gave us presents. Their forgiveness is not weakness but strength from confidence in their beliefs." After returning to Hiroshima, he worked as occupation translator, facilitating democratic municipal reforms. Private Toshiro Suzuki made ultimate imperial ideology rejection by choosing permanent exile over surrender shame. Unlike German prisoners escaping to return home, Suzuki escaped Camp Livingston to remain in America illegally. He worked as New Orleans gardener, married an Italian-American woman, raised children who never learned his prisoner past. Immigration records show voluntary surrender in 1963, seeking legal status after 18 years' successful integration. His 1965 naturalization represented complete transformation from emperor's warrior to American citizen. When asked why he chose America over Japan, Suzuki replied, "Here I learned a man's worth comes from his character, not his birth or his nation's victories." Angel Island stands empty now, weathered by Pacific storms, but the encounter between warrior culture and democratic values echoes through 7 decades of alliance. The unusual sights that stunned Japanese prisoners became blueprints for reconstruction. Unlike German captives returning to functioning democracy, Japanese prisoners carried democratic seeds to devastated homeland, requiring complete rebuilding. Their testimony influenced millions of civilians accepting MacArthur's reforms. Former prisoners became teachers explaining constitutional principles, translators facilitating occupation policies, business leaders implementing democratic workplace practices. Sergeant Nakamura returned to Nagoya in 1946 carrying more than memories. He brought knowledge that individual freedom strengthens rather than weakens society, that diverse peoples create unity through cooperation, that democracy's apparent chaos generates actual strength. His students learned American industrial methods alongside democratic values. Guns won battles, but dignity won the war. By treating prisoners as human beings, America created not enemies, but future allies. Japanese prisoners expected barbarous captors, but discovered advanced civilization, transforming enemies through simple recognition of shared humanity. The foundations of imperial ideology, built on assumptions of enemy barbarism and Japanese moral superiority, began cracking under accumulated contradictions too numerous and consistent to dismiss as elaborate deception. If the medicine shocked them, the democracy broke them. The cross-country train journey westward to permanent camps revealed American abundance and civilian freedom that seemed like elaborate theatrical deception designed to break prisoner morale through displays of impossible prosperity. Unlike the sealed cattle cars used for Japanese military transport, prisoners traveled in heated passenger coaches with cushioned seats and unrestricted window views of the American interior. The landscape streaming past the windows contradicted every intelligence briefing about American industrial weakness and civilian desperation under wartime conditions. Illinois farmlands stretched endlessly toward horizons that seemed to extend beyond geographical possibility. Mechanical harvesters moved through wheat fields like prehistoric dinosaurs, replacing dozens of workers with single operators controlling machinery that belonged to science fiction rather than agricultural reality. Grain elevators towered beside railroad tracks, their concrete silos storing more wheat than Japan imported annually from all sources combined. Electric power lines carried energy to isolated farmhouses that blazed with wasteful illumination even during daylight hours, displaying abundance that would have been criminal waste in resource-starved Japan. At Chicago's Union Station, documented in station logs from September 1943, Japanese prisoners observed American families conducting farewells with public emotional displays, forbidden in militaristic Japan. Wives embraced husbands, departing for training camps, while children clung to fathers' uniforms without shame or restraint. Teenagers shared milkshakes at station restaurants, boys and girls together without chaperones, their laughter echoing through marble corridors where enemy prisoners waited under minimal guard supervision. The industrial heartland revealed production capacity that made Japanese war effort seem pathetically inadequate by comparison. Steel mills near Gary, Indiana, operated continuous shifts with blast furnaces glowing orange against night skies like artificial suns. Worker housing spread for miles around each facility, individual houses with gardens rather than military barracks or industrial dormitories. Personal automobiles filled employee parking lots, luxury items available to common laborers rather than restricted to military and political elite. Through Ohio, the trains passed aircraft factories operating without camouflage or concealment, their corporate names displayed in huge letters visible from passenger windows. The Wright Aeronautical Corporation plant in Cincinnati had parking lots filled with workers' personal vehicles. Prisoners could count bomber engines lined up for delivery, without any security restrictions or attempts to hide strategic production from enemy observation. The casual attitude toward operational security challenged every assumption about wartime procedures and enemy intelligence gathering. At a scheduled stop in Indianapolis, American civilians gathered to observe enemy prisoners with curiosity rather than hatred or fear. Children pressed against station windows while parents explained the differences between German and Japanese uniforms. Vendors sold newspapers and snacks to travelers, while enemy soldiers watched from coach windows. The casual normalcy of civilian life during total war seemed strategically impossible to military minds trained in absolute mobilization and total resource dedication. The sight of American women moving freely through public spaces without male supervision or protective escort violated every assumption about gender roles and social order. Female travelers carried luggage, purchased tickets, made independent decisions about transportation and destinations. Some wore trousers rather than traditional feminine clothing. Others operated businesses visible from the train platforms. The absence of rigid gender segregation suggested social chaos, yet everything functioned with obvious efficiency and order. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, established in August 1942 on 700 acres of former farmland, housed 4,000 Japanese prisoners in wooden barracks that resembled college dormitories more than military prisons. The compound leadership structure violated every principle of Imperial Army hierarchy that Sergeant Nakamura had absorbed through 15 years of faithful service. On his third morning at McCoy, prisoners gathered in Recreation Hall B for their first experience with democratic election procedures. The concept itself seemed like elaborate mockery, designed to humiliate captives, enemy prisoners choosing their own leaders through secret ballot rather than appointment by military rank or imperial designation. Captain Harold Morrison, the camp commander whose grandfather had immigrated from County Cork during the Irish potato famine, explained the process through interpreter Staff Sergeant George Nakashima. Prisoners would elect compound spokesmen, recreation committee members, educational coordinators, and dispute resolution panels. Every decision affecting daily life would involve prisoner participation rather than administrative decree. Private Yamada, barely 20 years old and lowest-ranking soldier present, raised his hand to ask questions during the briefing. In Imperial Army culture, such behavior from an enlisted man addressing officers would merit severe punishment, including public beating and disciplinary confinement. Here, Captain Morrison answered patiently, encouraging further questions rather than punishing presumptuous behavior. When Yamada suggested modifications to meal scheduling based on Buddhist prayer requirements, Morrison took careful notes and promised serious consideration of the proposal. A private can question an officer and suggest improvements, Nakamura thought, watching this impossible interaction. In Japan, he would be beaten unconscious for such insubordination. The election process consumed an entire week of campaigning, debates, and position statements that would have been inconceivable under Divine Emperor system. Corporal Tanaka argued for longer library hours to accommodate educational pursuits. Sergeant Fujiwara advocated expanded agricultural work programs to maintain physical fitness. Technical Sergeant Kimura proposed inter-compound baseball tournaments to build morale and friendly competition. Prisoners who had never questioned authority suddenly found themselves crafting political platforms and actively soliciting votes from peers. Campaign speeches, delivered in the recreation hall, created scenes that violated every principle of military organization. Enlisted men criticized officer proposals publicly, without retribution. Competing candidates debated policy differences through reasoned argument rather than rank assertion. The democratic process required prisoners to think independently, evaluate options, and make choices based on merit rather than obedience to hierarchy. Committee meetings every Tuesday evening in the camp school building created even deeper cognitive dissonance. Former Imperial Army officers sat at equal tables with enlisted men, discussing compound policies through parliamentary procedure rather than rank-based decree. When Sergeant Sato disagreed with Lieutenant Ito's proposal for mandatory morning calisthenics, he stated his opposition publicly, without fear of retribution or punishment. The lieutenant listened carefully, considered the argument on its merits, and modified his position based on reasoned discussion rather than hierarchical authority. University of Wisconsin extension programs challenged prisoners with ideas their own government had forbidden for decades. Professor William Hayes, who had studied at Tokyo Imperial University before the war and spoke fluent Japanese, conducted weekly seminars on American political philosophy in the camp library. His discussions of individual rights, democratic representation, and separation of powers introduced concepts that directly contradicted emperor worship and state supremacy doctrine. The camp library, stocked with volumes donated by Wisconsin communities, contained books banned in Japan since the 1930s. Democracy texts by Japanese Taisho-era liberals, socialist theory by executed political prisoners, Christian philosophy by condemned religious leaders, things you could be executed for owning back home, were now handed freely by the enemy for recreational reading. Prisoners could access works by Yoshino Sakuzo on democratic government, Uchimura Kanzo on Christian individualism, and Kotoku Shusui on socialist economic. Ideas that would have meant death to possess in Imperial Japan were available in enemy prison camps. Medical care equality, regardless of rank, particularly shocked former Imperial Army personnel accustomed to rigid privilege systems. When Lieutenant Hayashi developed pneumonia in December 1943, he received identical treatment to Private Watanabe, who suffered the same illness. No preferential medication based on officer status. No special accommodations for rank or family connections. No acknowledgement of hierarchical medical priority. American military doctors treated all patients as human beings, requiring care rather than ranks, deserving differentiated attention. Every vote cast, every committee decision made, every question answered without punishment, eroded Bushido foundations built on absolute obedience and unquestioning loyalty to divine authority. Daily democratic experiences accumulated into fundamental ideological crisis that challenged the entire structure of imperial thought and cultural identity. But the deepest cut came not from doctors or soldiers, but from American civilians. The great Western Sugar Company's beet fields stretched across Colorado's South Platte Valley like endless green oceans, each row precisely planted by machinery that defied Japanese agricultural understanding. Sergeant Nakamura gripped his hoe handle as Foreman Bill McKenzie explained the work rotation system at the Greeley processing plant. 80 cents per day in camp script, exactly the same base pay as American privates. Overtime opportunities for additional earnings. Mandatory rest breaks every 2 hours, regardless of production quotas or seasonal deadlines. The labor concept violated everything Nakamura knew about worker-employer relationships. In Japan, industrial workers endured 16-hour shifts without complaint, driven by duty to emperor and fear of punishment for inadequate productivity. Here, Mexican braceros from Chihuahua worked alongside German prisoners from Camp Carson, supervised by the same American civilians who treated enemy laborers as temporary employees rather than conquered slaves. When temperatures exceeded 90 degrees Fahrenheit, work stopped automatically, according to safety regulations. Protection standards that defended prisoners better than Imperial Army defended its own soldiers. At the Bemidji lumber camp in northern Minnesota, Technical Sergeant Hayashi operated steam-powered equipment that processed more timber in one morning than Japanese mills handled weekly. The Potlatch Forests Incorporated plant records, preserved in company archives, document productivity methods that seemed impossible by Japanese industrial standards. Workers competed for efficiency bonuses rather than avoiding punishment for inadequate output. Foremen encouraged suggestions for improvement rather than demanding silent obedience to established procedures. The casual abundance at food processing facilities created profound psychological shock that accumulated with each shift. The Del Monte Cannery in Rochelle, Illinois, where prisoners worked from September through November 1943, discarded perfectly edible corn for minor cosmetic imperfections. Ears with irregular kernels that would have been treasured in Japan. Tomatoes slightly underripe that families would have fought over during rationing. Green beans with minor blemishes that represented feast conditions by Japanese civilian standards, all destroyed while their countrymen faced systematic starvation. Plant supervisor Robert Walsh apologized to prisoners for requiring 12-hour shifts while offering time-and-a-half overtime pay that exceeded what most Japanese factory workers earned in an entire month. The concept that employers should apologize for demanding labor while providing compensation above subsistence levels contradicted every assumption about industrial relationships and worker exploitation. Worker housing provided at agricultural camps surpassed living conditions most prisoners had known in civilian life before military service. Individual bunks with clean mattresses rather than shared straw pallets. Electric lighting controlled by individual switches. Indoor plumbing with hot water available 24 hours daily. Recreational areas equipped with ping-pong tables and radios broadcasting American popular music. The Seabrook Farms facility in New Jersey, documented in company employment records, offered medical clinics staffed by qualified physicians, educational programs taught by certified teachers, and movie screenings featuring current Hollywood productions for all workers, regardless of nationality or prisoner status. At the Hormel meatpacking plant in Austin, Minnesota, prisoners witnessed automated processing lines that handled more livestock in a single 8-hour shift than Japanese facilities processed in entire months. Yet workers maintained union representation with genuine collective bargaining power, earned vacation time with full pay compensation, received injury compensation exceeding medical costs. Productivity achieved through positive incentives, rather than punishment-based intimidation, contradicted everything Imperial Army had taught about motivating subordinates and maximizing output. When Private Suzuki injured his hand-operating machinery at the Wisconsin Steelworks in Chicago, he received immediate medical attention from plant physicians. Workers' compensation payments continued throughout recovery period. Light-duty assignment until full healing occurred. Treatment that exceeded what Japanese soldiers could expect from their own military medical system, creating impossible psychological terrain for warriors trained to accept suffering without complaint or expectation of care. "We are prisoners of war," Suzuki whispered to his bunkmate that evening. "Yet they care for our welfare better than our divine emperor cared for his most loyal soldiers." The supervised shopping excursion to downtown Sparta, Wisconsin, on December 20, 1943, shattered every assumption about American women that imperial propaganda had carefully constructed over years of indoctrination. Sergeant Nakamura walked behind armed guards through Main Street, observing impossible sights that contradicted 3 years of military education about Western decadence and racial weakness. Mrs. Dorothy Henderson managed the First National Bank of Sparta, making complex financial decisions that affected entire farming communities, while her husband served with the Pacific Fleet somewhere in enemy waters. She wore professional business attire rather than submissive domestic clothing, spoke with confident authority to male subordinates who accepted her leadership without question, conducted major transactions without seeking masculine approval or guidance. In Imperial Japan, women bowed submissively in male presence and spoke only when specifically addressed by men. Here, female bank presidents commanded genuine respect from men who could have been samurai warriors in different circumstances. At Mueller's hardware store, Negro employees served white customers, alongside recent European immigrants and established Yankee families. The store manager, a second-generation German-American whose accent still carried traces of Bavaria, supervised a diverse staff that included an Irish-American clerk and a Polish-American bookkeeper. Productivity flowed from cooperative teamwork, rather than racial purity theories. Everything violated Japanese understanding of how racial hierarchy should function in civilized society. Christmas preparations throughout Monroe County demonstrated civilian resilience that seemed strategically impossible during total war. Families with sons fighting Japanese forces in distant Pacific theaters decorated homes with electric lights that blazed wastefully through winter nights. Children played openly in snow-covered streets without military supervision or fear of enemy attack. Teenagers gathered at Woolworth's soda fountain, sharing milkshakes and listening to jazz music that Nazi ideology had labeled degenerate Negro culture, but which Americans embraced as authentic national expression. The Sparta Herald newspaper, available at Kowalski's drugstore, where prisoners purchased personal items with earned script, contained editorials criticizing military strategy in the Pacific Theater. Citizens questioned Roosevelt's resource allocation policies, debated strategic decisions openly in print, demanded accountability from generals and admirals. Such public dissent would have meant immediate execution in Imperial Japan, yet American democracy appeared to thrive through organized disagreement rather than enforced unity and unquestioning obedience. First Presbyterian Church of Sparta had learned Japanese Christmas carols phonetically, specifically to welcome enemy prisoners to holiday services. Reverend William Patterson, whose son was officially listed as missing in action somewhere in the Philippines, led congregation members in singing Silent Night, using halting Japanese pronunciation. The theological discussions that followed compared Shinto emperor worship with Christian concepts of individual soul dignity before divine judgment that transcended earthly political authority. Mrs. Sarah Mackenzie, whose husband had died during the Pearl Harbor attack, approached prisoners after the service carrying a basket of homemade cookies and genuine curiosity about Japanese culture. "I baked these for you boys," she said simply. "Even though my husband died at Pearl Harbor. I figure you're somebody's sons too." Her questions about Buddhist philosophy and tea ceremony traditions carried no hatred despite devastating personal loss. When Corporal Ito explained the spiritual significance of cherry blossoms in Japanese aesthetics, she listened with respectful attention that transformed enemies into human beings, sharing universal experiences of beauty and mortality. American civilians treated Japanese prisoners as temporarily displaced persons, rather than permanent enemies deserving punishment. Store clerks offered assistance with purchases without suspicion or hostility. Children waved enthusiastically from school bus windows, rather than displaying fear or hatred. Elderly farmers discussed agricultural techniques without considering racial or national differences that supposedly made cooperation impossible. The psychological impact accumulated through countless small interactions that violated every expectation of barbarous treatment from racial inferiors. Every gentle word, every patient explanation, every act of ordinary human kindness eroded imperial ideology, built on assumptions of Western moral decay and inevitable racial conflict. By evening's end, as prisoners returned to Camp McCoy under winter stars, the cultural collision was complete. They had witnessed individual freedom functioning within stable social order. Democratic strength expressed through apparent chaos rather than imposed discipline. Human dignity transcending wartime hatred through simple recognition of shared humanity. Each gentle civilian encounter systematically dismantled propaganda foundations that had seemed unshakable before. Direct experience contradicted theoretical assumptions. 3 documented cases illustrate the complete transformation of Japanese prisoners from imperial warriors to democratic advocates through accumulated exposure to American values and daily contradictions of totalitarian ideology. Corporal Hiroshi Yamamoto arrived at Camp McCoy in October 1943, carrying a ceremonial tanto blade hidden in his boot, determined to restore personal honor through ritual suicide rather than endure captivity's permanent shame. His gradual transformation began with small contradictions that accumulated over 18 months of constant exposure to democratic values. The decisive turning point came during a University of Wisconsin literature seminar when Professor Hayes discussed Hamlet's famous soliloquy about suicide and moral courage in the face of impossible circumstances. Yamamoto realized that choosing life to serve others required greater bravery than choosing death to escape personal dishonor. Survival, to help rebuild Japan, demanded more courage than ritual suicide to preserve individual reputation. The Bushido concept of honorable death was revealed as selfish escape from responsibility to contribute to future generations. His letters home, monitored by military censors and preserved in National Archives Record Group 389, document gradual abandonment of Bushido suicide ideology. By March 1945, he wrote to his wife in Nagoya, describing American concepts of individual dignity that transcended military defeat. The Americans believe that every person possesses value that cannot be destroyed by temporary circumstances. He explained, "Defeat in war does not eliminate human worth or future possibilities for contributing to society." After repatriation in 1946, Yamamoto became a teacher in occupied Japan, actively advocating democratic education reforms based on prisoner camp experiences. His classroom discussions of American constitutional principles influenced thousands of Japanese students during Reconstruction. Former students later credited his teaching with helping them understand how democratic institutions could serve Japanese interests better than imperial authoritarianism. Technical Sergeant Kenji Moto's conversion from emperor worship to democratic ideals required complete spiritual reconstruction that challenged every assumption about divine authority and political legitimacy. Raised in a devout Shinto household that venerated Hirohito as direct descendant of sun goddess Amaterasu, Moto had never questioned imperial authority until witnessing American civilians criticizing Roosevelt without legal consequence or social punishment. Camp psychological evaluations, conducted monthly by Army psychiatrists trained in cultural sensitivity, tracked his ideological evolution from absolute loyalty to nuanced political thinking. The transformation process required systematic deconstruction of religious assumptions about political authority that had seemed beyond question throughout his entire life. The decisive moment occurred during Christmas 1944, when Wisconsin families provided carefully wrapped gift packages to enemy prisoners whose countrymen had killed American sons in Pacific combat. Moto wrote in his personal diary, later translated for camp records, "These people whose children we murdered gave us presents. They sang our songs. They invited us to their sacred celebrations. Their forgiveness is not weakness but strength that comes from confidence in their beliefs about human dignity." After returning to devastated Hiroshima in 1946, Moto worked as translator for occupation authorities, actively facilitating democratic reforms in municipal government. His first-hand knowledge of American democratic procedures proved invaluable in explaining constitutional concepts to Japanese officials accustomed to imperial decree rather than representative government. Private Toshiro Suzuki made the ultimate rejection of imperial ideology by choosing permanent exile rather than face surrender's shame in militaristic Japanese society. Camp records document his decision process through extensive interviews with camp psychologists and chaplains who tried to understand his reasoning. Unlike German prisoners who escaped camps attempting to return home to families, Suzuki escaped from Camp Livingston, Louisiana, in August 1945 specifically, to remain in America illegally rather than return to Japan. He worked as gardener for wealthy families in New Orleans, learning English through daily interaction with employers who treated him as valued employee rather than former enemy. Married an Italian-American woman in 1951, who knew his background but judged him by character rather than wartime service. Raised children who grew up completely American, never learning about their father's prisoner past until after his death. Immigration records show Suzuki voluntarily surrendered to federal authorities in 1963, seeking legal status after 18 years of successful integration into American society. The FBI investigation found no criminal activity beyond initial illegal entry. His 1965 naturalization ceremony represented complete transformation from emperor's warrior to American citizen, with full rights and responsibilities. When asked by immigration officials why he chose America over Japan, Suzuki replied with conviction born from decades of observation, "Here I learned that a man's worth comes from his character and contributions, not from his birth circumstances or his nation's military victories. America judges people by what they do, not where they come from." The broader statistical evidence documents transformation scope across the entire prisoner population, rather than isolated individual cases. Of 425,000 German prisoners held in America, escape attempts occurred regularly with some success. Japanese prisoners demonstrated different patterns that reflected cultural adaptation rather than resistance. Camp records show only 54 documented escape attempts by Japanese prisoners throughout the entire war period. Most involved curiosity about American society rather than desire to return home or continue fighting. Several escapees voluntarily returned to camps after brief exploration of civilian life. The low escape rate reflected gradual acceptance of American values rather than effective security measures. Post-war surveys conducted by American occupation authorities found 74% of returned Japanese prisoners held favorable views of American democracy. 61% supported Marshall Plan aid when announced. 55% advocated permanent German-American alliance. 38% expressed desire to immigrate to America legally. 23% maintained active correspondence with American families met during imprisonment. Immigration records show 5,000 former Japanese prisoners legally immigrated to America during the 1950s. Naturalization records indicate 92% became citizens within the minimum eligible time frame. Their American success rate, measured by employment stability, home ownership, and absence of criminal records, exceeded general immigrant populations by significant margins. The influence of returned prisoners on West German Reconstruction is extensively documented in occupation records and German historical archives. Former prisoners occupied significant positions in the new democratic government and civil society. 48 became members of the Bundestag during its early years. 312 served as mayors or city council members in major German cities. 1,847 worked directly in agricultural modernization programs. 2,341 taught in reconstituted schools throughout the American occupation zone. Hans-Georg Fenstermacher, former prisoner and later prominent German industrialist, told American historians in 1965, "We returned from America with more than memories of better food and comfortable housing. We brought practical knowledge of how democracy functions in daily life, how free markets operate efficiently, how diverse peoples cooperate productively. We had seen the future, and we knew it worked, because we had lived it." Angel Island stands empty now, its processing buildings weathered by Pacific storms and decades of abandonment. But the brief encounter between ancient warrior culture and modern democratic values echoes through 7 decades of Japanese-American alliance. The unusual sights that stunned Japanese prisoners upon arrival became practical blueprints for post-war reconstruction of an entire nation's political and social systems. Unlike German captives, who returned to functioning democratic institutions with centuries of development, Japanese prisoners carried democratic seeds to a devastated homeland, requiring complete social rebuilding from feudal foundations. Their testimony about American society influenced millions of Japanese civilians' gradual acceptance of MacArthur's revolutionary reforms. The occupation succeeded partly because returned prisoners validated American intentions through personal experience rather than merely accepting American power through military defeat. Former prisoners became teachers, explaining American constitutional principles to students who had never imagined alternatives to imperial rule. They worked as translators, facilitating occupation policies with cultural sensitivity born from understanding both systems. They established businesses implementing democratic workplace practices that respected individual dignity while maintaining productive efficiency. Their influence extended far beyond their numbers because they possessed credibility that came from having lived under both systems and experienced the contrast directly. Sergeant Nakamura, who had whispered, "This is not hell," upon first glimpsing American abundance, returned to devastated Nagoya in 1946, carrying more than personal memories of better treatment. He brought systematic knowledge of how individual freedom strengthens rather than weakens society, how diverse peoples create unity through voluntary cooperation, how democracy's apparent chaos generates actual strength through channeled disagreement and reasoned compromise. His students at Nagoya Technical College learned American industrial methods alongside democratic values, understanding that technological progress and political freedom reinforced each other rather than competing for social priority. The next generation of Japanese leaders absorbed lessons that shaped Japan's emergence as a democratic industrial power allied with, rather than opposed to, American interests. The transformation proved that military victory alone cannot create lasting peace between former enemies. Guns won battles through superior firepower and strategic advantage, but dignity won the war by treating prisoners as human beings capable of change rather than permanent enemies, deserving only punishment. American prison camps became inadvertent schools for democracy that produced graduates who returned home as advocates for the very system that had defeated them. Japanese prisoners expected to find barbarous captors who would confirm imperial propaganda about Western racial inferiority and moral corruption. Instead, they discovered an advanced civilization that transformed enemies into allies through simple recognition of shared humanity and consistent application of stated values, rather than mere rhetoric about democratic ideals. The greatest American victory was not achieved on Pacific battlefields, but in prison camps, where the daily demonstration of democratic principles accomplished what military conquest alone could never achieve. The voluntary transformation of an entire enemy culture, from militaristic authoritarianism to peaceful democracy, allied with its former conquerors in defending freedom against new totalitarian threats.